We're looking forward to hearing from two amazing lawyers. Our moderator is AFJ's own legal director, Daniel Goldberg. Daniel served as Chief of Staff for the Office of Legislative Affairs at the Department of Justice, and 6 years as Senior Counsel to Tom Harkin. I am so pleased to turn the program over to him. Take it away, Daniel.
Thank you, Nan. Honored to be here and honored to be joined by hundreds of people on this call. It's really a testament to the times that we live in that so many people are willing to give up a Wednesday evening to hear a critical conversation about the rule of law, about attacks on the independence of the Justice Department, and really what's happening in our country in terms of constitutional rights and critical legal protections. And we're really honored to be joined by two national legal commentators and people who throughout their careers have made such a difference in the lives of so many people, both in Alabama and New York and nationally. So really just honored to be here with Joyce Vance and Wiley. Joyce, both individuals who need no introduction, but Joyce served as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama from 2009 to 2017, was actually the first woman appointed U.S. Attorney by Barack Obama. As U.S. Attorney, she was responsible for overseeing all federal criminal investigations and prosecutions in Northern Alabama, including matters involving civil rights, national security, cybercrime, public corruption, healthcare, corporate fraud, violent crime, and drug trafficking. And before she became U.S. Attorney, Joyce served as an assistant U.S. Attorney in the office for 18 years. She currently is a law professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. Maya also is a nationally renowned expert on rule of law issues, racial justice, and equity. Ms. Wiley is currently the Senior Vice President for Social Justice at the New School University and the Henry Cohen Professor of Public and Urban Policy at the New School's Milano School of Management, Policy, and Environment. Prior to the New School, she was counsel to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio and a chief legal advisor and member of his senior cabinet. Among other things, she also served as chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. She worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and ACLU. And like Joyce and myself, also a DOJ alumni, served as an AUSA in the Southern District of New York. So really honored to be joined by both of you. This event actually started several months ago. Joyce and I were speaking after Roger Stone was in the headlines, and there's a lot of attention being paid to the assault on the rule of law and the independence of the Justice Department. And all three of us at that time joined, I think, approximately 2,500 other former DOJ officials in signing a letter calling on William Barr to resign. So I'd actually like to start the conversation not today, but several months ago, and ask why you both signed that letter. What were you seeing now, and why the assaults on the Justice Department were so concerning then, and then we'll bring it up to the present day.
Who do you want to start, Dan?
Maya?
I was going to say Joyce. Well, I actually authored an opinion piece in which I argued that Bill Barr had earned himself an impeachment inquiry. And obviously, there was a long list of reasons, the most recent of which at the time that I wrote that piece was that when a whistleblower complaint came from the National Security Inspector General, it essentially got somehow stopped at the Department of Justice from being sent over to Congress, which is what was supposed to happen. And according to news reports, Bill Barr and his office had been engaged in that conversation. Now, we don't know what, but it was a deeply troubling example of a Bill Barr, highest law enforcement officer in the land, responsible for making sure that the public trust is protected as well as the rule of law, with what we all thought was a pretty straightforward statute and process, given that the Inspector General had found that this was serious and that there was evidence that supported the whistleblower's complaints. And as we know, that led to an impeachment process for Donald Trump. That's just one of the many examples in which Bill Barr has essentially suggested that he's much more interested in being Donald Trump's defense attorney than an independent arbiter of the law. Certainly, an attorney general has the role and responsibility of advancing the policy agenda of a sitting president, but certainly does not and should not ever compromise the rule of law in order to do that, because he represents the people of the United States and the interests of the people of the United States. Many other reasons we could go through. Joyce, I'm sure, will mention them as well. I'll stop there.
Joyce, you were a political official at the Department of Justice, appointed and confirmed by the Senate. What was your concerns regarding what you were seeing from Bill Barr and the Justice Department under President Trump?
So I'd echo many of Maya's concerns. We're very much in agreement on this. Excuse me, horrible allergy season in Alabama, so I apologize if I'm coughing all night. One of the most important things that an attorney general does is to protect the independence of the Justice Department when it comes to prosecuting its cases from political interference. Bill Barr has let that independence erode in intolerable ways. If you haven't come from inside of the Justice Department, that might sound a little bit strange, right? Because the Attorney General is, after all, the president's appointee. He's a political appointee. He works for the president. So what do we mean when we talk about independence? And it's a very delicate balance. And frankly, it's not written any place in law. It's most importantly protected by practice. And this really stems in large part from the fallout of the Nixon administration. But the Attorney General works for the president when it comes to policy. If the president wants to do criminal justice reform, as President Obama did, then the Attorney General implements those policy objectives. When it comes to individual cases, who gets prosecuted, it's time for the White House to be hands-off. In fact, there's typically a practice inside of the Justice Department that permits very few people in the White House to have contact with people in the Justice Department. It's usually just somebody in the Deputy Attorney General's office, somebody in the AG's office, and those two principals. White House doesn't get to influence cases. It became very clear, and I joined this letter and have expressed objection to Bill Barr's conduct as Attorney General because he did not maintain independence. He has in effect acted as the president's lawyer, protecting the president's interests and the president's friends, rather than making sure that cases are prosecuted without fear or favor. So that, I would say, is the basis for my objection to much of what Bill Barr has done as Attorney General.
Now, one common theme since Donald Trump has become president is expansive views of executive power. This appears to be a passion of William Barr's as well, has driven many of the decisions at the Justice Department. And since the pandemic, this president, a combination of pandemic plus being excused from impeachment, has become even more brazen in his exertions of broad executive powers, basically saying Article 2 of the Constitution gives me the authority to do anything I want. There's been an extensive power grab from both the White House, aided by the Justice Department. What concerns do you see coming from the Justice Department and the White House with respect to executive power and rule of law issues?
Well, you know,
go ahead, Joyce.
Go ahead, Maya.
Nope, you go first this time and I will follow you gladly.
You know, this notion of expansive executive power is something that was very fringe. This was very much an outlier's point of view until the Trump administration came along. And Trump has had folks who all along have supported his expansive views. No one more stridently, though, than this Attorney General, than William Barr, has proposed that the president should grasp power. The first hint that we had of that was in Barr's initial weeks in office, when he talked about the outcome of the Mueller report. And we knew from Barr's confirmation process, where he had submitted a 19-page unrequested letter to both the White House and the Justice Department, that he took this very broad view that the president could do whatever he wanted to do, essentially, without violating the law. You'll recall Barr's view was the president cannot commit obstruction of justice so long as he's pursuing presidential objectives. And so I'm sort of painting that with a broad brush, but we have continued to see those themes where William Barr has consistently supported the president when he's made these broad stroke assertions that he is, in essence, more emperor than he is president. And these are not mainstream beliefs. This is not the stuff that constitutional lawyers' dreams are made of. Instead, this is a point of view that's radical, that's extreme, that's in many ways unsupported by the tradition of American legal thinking. And something that I think the three of us may have talked about as we were contemplating this event is that it's also very singular in that Barr applies it to this president, but certainly would have never applied it to a President Obama. So in many ways, it's a results-oriented point of view as opposed to a theoretical, consistent, logical approach to governing.
I think that's really important. It's more about the ends justify the means, and it doesn't matter what damage it does to the rule of law, to public trust in government along the way. I think for me, one of the things that's so striking in this most recent round of news is that you have Bill Barr saying that because of his concerns about protecting the US Constitution and balancing constitutional rights with what states are trying to do to protect its residents from the coronavirus, a public health threat that is, we know, is extremely serious, that he actually says out loud that he's now going to be investigating and looking at what states are doing and whether or not they're crossing that line. This comes from the Attorney General, whose office sent over to Congress their thoughts about the powers that should exist in this pandemic, in a pandemic situation, that would include their ability to ask chief judges of federal courts to essentially just stop people's habeas corpus protections, right? Literally say, we can arrest people and yet decide when they will see a judge, no matter how long that we decide that can wait. That is outrageous, particularly because what they sent over to Congress was so overbroad from what would be, certainly there were some things in it that would be logical to ask for and debate if you couldn't have courts open for some reason. We had federal courts bending over backwards to figure out ways to actually continue to move cases through without endangering public health. There was an important conversation that needed to happen there, and some important steps that courts were taking, including looking at online options. But they were asking for not only in this pandemic, but any undefined emergency or civil disobedience. That is very scary language to come out of a Department of Justice without modulating, defining, or even adding the kinds of boundaries you would expect that would take into account an emergency and balance it with people's constitutional rights. So back to Joyce's point, I think what we are seeing is a very selective idea of when and how you protect constitutional rights. And in this case, what William Barr is really doing is saying Donald Trump wants to go after states restricting, quote unquote, the economy, By the way, there are stores open. I live in an epicenter. We have stores open. Everything that is essential remains open. What are closed are the things that are non-essential. And so what we hear William Barr basically saying and saying publicly is, yeah, shots fired. We're shooting shots over the bow, essentially trying to intimidate some of these governors who are not really going along with our desire that they reopen perhaps more quickly and not in the way we would like. That, I think, is a very dangerous signal, even if they're not going to actually take legal action. But one of the disturbing things that we're hearing in the news cycle is that he, in fact, has been in conversation with conservative groups, which suggests that this is more ideological than about whether or not constitutional rights are being violated by restrictions that are overbroad. That's something we all need to worry about.
Joyce, following up on what Maya talked about, the Department of Justice during the pandemic has not been front and center in the news. They have not appeared to take a leadership role as they have in the past. Yet William Barr gave a very controversial interview with Laura Ingraham, where he defended the president, where he criticized for Americans for quote unquote hiding under the bed, for questioning, for politicizing Donald Trump's decision to encourage the research into some drugs and not others. He called Donald Trump statesmanlike. And then, as Maya alluded to, he was highly critical of the decisions by governors and mayors to protect the health and safety of the American people. How seriously should we take some of the statements coming from William Barr and the Department of Justice? Or is this really for an audience of one? Is this really Bill Barr saying to Donald Trump, I got your back, I'm a team player?
You know, this is the eternal question, not just with Bill Barr, but with so many of the people that work for this president. Are they saying what they really mean? Are they suggesting what policy will look like? Are they just trying to pacify their boss? That's obviously a dysfunctional sort of a architecture for the executive branch to work within. And that's something that we've talked about in other contexts. And I won't belabor the point here. But Maya says something really important here that I don't want to move away from too quickly when she talks about the kind of approaches that we've seen this Attorney General willing to take. You point out some of the Attorney General's comments that are clearly unwarranted by the science on COVID-19. Whether or not there's a role for DOJ in a crisis like this, and I would expect as a former United States attorney that DOJ would have a significant and sustained role to play. But the problem is this: you can't make policy, particularly in a crisis, on the basis of ideology. You have to make policy on the basis of data. And here we have an attorney general who not only seems to ignore important data, he simply assumes the ideology, so that if the president wants expansive powers, he supports that. If the president is promoting whatever the snake oil du jour is, then the attorney general is going to push that. And this, again, I think is what we're talking about, this sort of decay at Main Justice. But it's important to point out that this is a problem that exists at the desk that William Barr sits at. And all across the country, there are assistant United States attorneys, there are United States attorneys, there are DOJ employees who've got their heads down and they're doing their jobs working for the American people without entering this sort of dysfunctional policy content. So I think it's really important for us to understand that the work of the department in many ways continues, but this policy that's being set on the basis of ideology, not data, is a very dangerous phenomenon.
Now, what are they doing that hasn't made the New York Times front page? Obviously, people are dying. We're in a health crisis. We're in an economic crisis, and issues involving the pandemic are rightly front and center. Are there issues beneath the surface where the Department of Justice and the executive branch are using this opportunity to advance an agenda harmful to the American people. Maya?
Yeah, I actually, there are two, I'm going to name two that are, I think, extremely important. One is what we're seeing them do around land. And for Native tribes, what we're seeing is, for interest with the Mashpee Wampanoag in Massachusetts, in Cape Cod, the Department of Interior had granted them trust rights in their land. That's the ability for them to set up their reservation. And the Trump administration has taken it away. They've done something similar also with a Native tribe in California. And there's a real question about what's going on with their, with the way they're treating the rights, the land rights of Native people in this country. They're also doing it with eminent domain at the border around homeowners' rights and where they want the wall. So that's something that I think we have to pay attention to with much more intention than I think we're seeing it, is the way in which they're interacting and whose interests they're advancing with the ways in which they're going after land. But the other one that I think we're not talking about enough, and this I think we can rest directly also on William Barr, is what's happening with white supremacy in this country. And you know what the Department of Justice did in 2019 was extremely disturbing. First of all, it took data and collapsed the category of data of white supremacist crimes so that it was equating what white supremacists were doing with what Black extremists were doing. The problem with that is that it then masks how serious white supremacy has become in this country. Because there was in 2019, what surfaced was that white supremacists were responsible for all the violent acts that fell into the category in 2018, and it was the highest number since 1975. Now that's the kind of thing you want data and the transparency of that data, then to raise the conversation about what law enforcement, what the FBI, what the Department of Justice is doing to protect people. Here in New York City, we've seen a tremendous jump in anti-Semitic crime, for example. And certainly that happens across groups. We are hearing now from people who have been engaged in trying to keep people out of white supremacist groups that they are using the pandemic to actively recruit. And that is something that, given just the rise in hate, particularly the astronomical rise since the Trump administration took office, the fact that the Department of Justice defunded grants to groups that were actually working to keep people out of white supremacist groups, and then started hiding the data. And when Congress, when the Senate Intelligence Committee asked for the data, when it found out that they deep-sixed this report on 2018 numbers in 2019, Bill Barr's Department of Justice refused to provide it. So it's both the refusal to be transparent to Congress, which is a power grab in and of itself by not allowing Congress to do its constitutional duty. It's also not allowing citizens to know when to petition government, because government may not be paying sufficient attention to very serious concerns. And now, in the context of a pandemic, we are seeing, for example, Donald Trump saying, I don't think states and cities with sanctuary laws should get grants. New York City has been litigating the fact that we have lost one, as a prime city that has to worry about terrorism, we've lost one of the largest grants because the Trump administration wants to punish New York City and New York State for having laws they don't like, even though they don't have any legal requirement. They don't get in the way of immigration authorities doing their job, but they don't let public officers help. That is fundamental to some of our constitutional questions and issues, but also just to our ability to protect our people and to do it in a way, again, that balance public interests and rights and policy. And I'm deeply concerned that we're not talking about that enough.
Joyce, in addition to what DOJ is doing, what are they not doing? What are the American people missing from a Department of Justice in terms of not enforcing critical laws?
So, DOJ can be a very nimble organization. We don't typically think of it that way. It's big, changing courses like steering a battleship. But in a crisis situation, in an emergency, DOJ does have a lot of flexibility. It's important to remember that it's not just the lawyers, not just the US attorneys, but also the law enforcement agencies. So FBI, DEA, ATF, and the United States Marshals Service. And those capabilities give DOJ the flexibility to respond and to help communities with community needs in a crisis. We haven't really seen DOJ out front and center using its resources to do that. That might just mean that DOJ is playing a quiet role in community and whatever sort of joint task forces are running the show. But typically one would expect to see sort of a leadership role happening that I don't think has emerged here. I hope that will happen. That's in many ways where DOJ is at its best, when it's working with local organizations and entities. But the organization writ large could and should be playing a much larger role in two key policy areas where it seems to be absent. The first is prisons and jails. And we know that the Federal Bureau of Prisons has plenty of problems of its own. Yesterday, BOP saw the 30th death among people that are incarcerated in its facilities, a pregnant woman who died at a federal prison facility. States have been largely operating in an unknown space here. Testing has been difficult to come by. Rates of infection in prisons have largely gone undocumented and untested, but we know that prisons are a real hot zone for infection, both because it's a closed environment where people who are incarcerated aren't able to protect themselves. They can't wash their hands. They can't socially distance. They can't wear masks like we can. And also you have guards and other support staff who come in and work in the prison every day and then go home to their families at the end of the day. So you have a vector for transmission of the disease, both back and forth. It's a situation where DOJ should be stepping up, setting some requirements for how prisons are handling these situations, aggressively working to use compassionate leave policies and other policies like that to remove people who are at risk of getting the disease and low risk of recidivating in their communities, and remove them from the prison population. And I'll give you a concrete example because this is a big nationwide problem. It's hard to get our arms, I think, around the entirety of the problem. Alabama has one of the most overcrowded prison systems in the country, 170% of capacity. Over a year ago, in April of 2019, the Justice Department issued a report under a statute called CRIPA, the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act, and it found that Alabama's men's prisons were violating the Constitution, that they were holding people in cruel and unusual punishment over a year ago. But DOJ has not yet forced the state to make steps to remediate those conditions. And in fact, in Alabama, the State Bureau of Pardons and Paroles shut down its work as part of the coronavirus pandemic, I think actually a little bit ahead of it, refusing to hold hearings and act on requests of people who were eligible to be released. So if anything, sort of adding to the prison population, not taking steps to diminish it. DOJ should be present in that situation and in other situations like it across the country, as well as in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. But we've not seen much from the Attorney General. He's said a few things about this. He's not engaged. Second area where DOJ has largely been absent is protecting elections in November. Instead, DOJ continues to be focused on voter fraud. We know that there's, statistically speaking, not a lot of fraud. In fact, in 2017, the president established an election integrity commission to search for fraud across the country. That commission had to fold several months later, and it was unable to find statistically significant fraud, other than an incidental case here and there. Fraud is not a problem. The problem is voter suppression. keeping people who are entitled to vote from voting. And so here's the issue that we have. There are many states where people can vote by mail, right? Fill out your ballot, pop it in the prepaid envelope, and it goes off. And this is a system that works really well. About 25% of the country votes this way. In other states, that's not possible. In fact, to get an absentee ballot, you may have to have an excuse that's mandated by state law, and fear of getting the coronavirus may not be an excuse that works in some of those states. You may have to jump through a lot of hoops to get an absentee ballot, like having a photocopy of your driver's license that you mail in to get it, the Alabama rule. It doesn't do much to prevent fraud, but it can be very difficult to do, particularly if you're poor or elderly. And so it acts as a de facto mechanism for suppressing voting. DOJ should be out aggressively protecting people's right to vote safely in November. Nobody should be at risk of getting sick or dying because they want to exercise a fundamental right. DOJ is absent from that space too.
Just a reminder to folks, if you have questions for Joyce or Maya, please email rachel@afj.org. That's RACHEL@afj.org if you have a question. My last question before opening up to the audience is, let's say you're nominated and confirmed to be the 86th Attorney General of the United States on January 20th, 2021. You're inheriting a department that, as we've talked about, the independence of the department has been under attack, where critical missions of the department have been undervalued, and where morale, quite frankly, is low. You have the President of the United States calling Department of Justice officials human scum, without defense from the Attorney General. There's a lot that the next Attorney General of the United States is going to undertake. A, what is your first steps? What is the first thing you do on day one? And second, how long will it take to reverse the damage that has been done to what, quite frankly, used to be and remains a great institution that is under assault? Maya, why don't I talk to you, turn it over to you.
Well, I'll start with something that at least was reported in the media. I don't have personal information of it, that Colin Powell did when he became Secretary of State. The first thing he did was he sat down with staff, and I don't mean in a huge group. He met individually, and not just with senior people, all the way down the line. He went through the State Department and met individually with staff, no matter their level in the department, to ask them how it was going. And that sounds like a small thing, but that's important for two reasons. One, in inheriting a department, and one as important as the Department of Justice, and having that level of demoralization, but also that level of where are people's commitment, what are they committed to? It's like getting a sense of that, getting a sense of what their experiences has been, what their passion is, what kind of support they need to do the job effectively. Those are not small things. But the second thing I would do is I would absolutely work quickly to build back up units of the department that are critical for doing a number of the things that Joyce and I have just been talking about, including the Civil Rights Division, including counterterrorism that takes very seriously threats where we see data that the threats should be. And I would work very hard, and as anyone would be. I'm not applying for the job, by the way, when I say me, but it's a really important job. But I think that the last thing I'll say, and it's not the last thing, is really figuring out how to ensure that people committed to the rule of law and to protecting our residents are getting what they need to do it effectively, and that people who are interested in blocking that are being evaluated fairly and appropriately on how well they're doing the job that they've actually been paid to do, which is not about ideology. It's about meeting the needs of the people by protecting the rule of law and their rights.
Now, Joyce, you came into your position as U.S. Attorney in 2009. The Eric Holder inherited a Justice Department that had also seen attacks on the rule of law. You had the U.S. Attorney scandal under Alberto Gonzales. You had the hiring scandal, the politicized hiring. How did you and Eric Holder and the leadership of the Obama Justice Department address some of these critical issues coming in on day one?
Well, I think Maya would make a great Attorney General, and I'd be happy to work for Attorney General Wiley. So I'm just going to put in that bid for a position right now, Maya. But everything that Maya says here is exactly right. And it's borne out by the experience that we had of having to undo some of the damage that we inherited when the Obama folks took over DOJ. And when I say damage, let me be very specific about what I'm talking about. DOJ and our justice system works because the community, the public, our citizens believe in its integrity. When that public confidence in DOJ's integrity is damaged, then we can't really do our job, because when we have to make those close calls in marginal cases, people are going to ask questions. Can they trust DOJ? Can they not trust DOJ? It's so important that DOJ's behavior be both in accomplishing its goals, but also in its appearance, not motivated by politics, motivated by the facts, motivated by the law. Always do the right thing. Who you are, who your friends are, who your family is, just shouldn't matter, right? And so that's that same sort of damage that's been done to DOJ's reputation under Trump. The day one job for the next Attorney General will be to restore DOJ's integrity and the community's ability to have confidence that when DOJ makes a decision to indict a case or dismiss a case or take any other action, that action is motivated by the law and the facts and not by politics. So we often say that DOJ's integrity is like a reservoir, very, very slow to fill with water, but it can all leak out with a simple pinprick and a teeny tiny hole, and all of that hard work is for naught. So I think it will be a long-term battle to restore DOJ's integrity in the community. But I will say one thing that is perhaps a little bit optimistic, and it's this. The people that work for DOJ are committed, not just to the work that they do, but also to the institution. And so my experience as a brand new U.S. attorney, I came on at a point in time where there were both Republican and Democratic U.S. attorneys still in the mix. As one of the first Obama U.S. attorneys, I got strong support and even mentoring from some of the Bush U.S. attorneys who were still in their position. They helped us understand what issues we faced as a community and what work we needed to do so that we could move forward. And I think that same level of interaction and trust among career people and political people and people who come in on the landing team at DOJ to begin to figure out what course the next administration will take, I expect that it's the people that will bring the institution back into balance.
I'll turn to audience questions. A reminder, if you have a question for Joyce and Maya, please email rachel@afj.org. The first question we have is a specific question, and then I'll broaden it to a general question. You talked about the attacks on sanctuary cities. Can the president condition emergency funds on abolishing sanctuary cities? That's the specific question. And then broadening the question, obviously the federal government, the executive branch, has been given, I think, powers that we would all agree with, extraordinary powers to help address this health and economic crisis. Including an enormous amount of federal funds at their disposal. What conditions can they put on those federal funds? And how can we ensure that a president and an executive branch that has great theories of executive power are not using that power as they distribute these critical federal dollars?
Well, you know, that this is such an important question, especially when we know that this administration has already tried to use the power of the purse to essentially undermine some of the powers that states and localities have. And the issue with sanctuary cities, I mean, my short answer is no, Donald Trump and his administration does not have the power to discriminate against states based on their power to take particular policy positions. But having said that, this is being played out in the courts right now. And, you know, we had several federal courts that said where there was sanctuary city litigation over these law enforcement grants that I mentioned. Ironically, the grants were named after a fallen New York City police officer, the ones that New York City lost. New York City used to get $4 million a year from this grant, and it was to protect the people of the city of New York. This is something that the courts were continuously saying, no, you can't do that. But the Second Circuit disagreed. So here in New York, our circuit court disagreed. This is something that I suspect will go all the way to the Supreme Court. So how the Supreme Court will rule, that's something that legal scholars will debate. But I would say certainly when it comes to blanket aid, that's going to be formalistic for the federal government to say, well, we'll allow red states that have done what they agree with us ideologically on, will get emergency assistance, and states that we don't agree with politically will not get emergency assistance. It will be a very dangerous day if that rules the land, but I'm fairly optimistic that on something as broad as emergency relief, that won't happen. Specific grant programs may be treated differently. There are many different ways we could get into. There are probably a lot of law review articles being written on this right now, but that is the reality that we're living with. And I think one of the things that's so important about the Alliance for Justice, Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, and so many other important groups is that it does matter whether we're appointing federal judges who are going to pay attention to our case law and our Constitution and are qualified to do so and will do so rightly.
Joyce, going to the broader point, how do we constrain on an incredible amount of discretion on the part of the executive branch with respect to the distribution of federal funds and assistance in this critical health and economic crisis? At a time when we're dealing with an executive branch which has delusions of unchecked executive power.
So, it's so important to always remind ourselves that when we're talking about federal funds, we're talking about taxpayer dollars. We're talking about your money and my money. And so this notion that the president is going to withhold money that we've given to the federal government from us in a time of crisis, whether it turns out to be legal or not in its specific applications, is just really absolutely appalling, and no decent human being would ever consider taking an action of this sort. I think, honestly, it's important that we not lose sight of what this really is. It's easy to objectify it in a legal context. We need to all acknowledge what's going on here, though. Of course, this is a president who loves to make policy via quid pro quo, right? So he's essentially telling the states here, I'm going to give you your taxpayer dollars, but first I need you to do me a favor, though. Something that we've heard before from this president. The question you asked that's a very serious one here, I think, is how do we make sure that the government, when it's administering a broad program like this, plays by all the rules? And one of the key checks that we always have that makes this sort of a system work is a series of independent inspector generals, the IGs, whose job it is to oversee these sorts of programs. We know here that the president blocked the appointment of a highly respected former DOJ Inspector General, Glenn Fine, who would have been sort of the coronavirus, for lack of a better term, inspector general. And what an inspector general does is his or her job is to make sure that there's no fraud, waste, and abuse in the use of government funding in these kind of programs. Now we know we'll have a watered down IG for this program, someone I think who will come from inside of the Trump White House. And so the short answer to your question, how do we oversee and make sure that this is fair, is that we can't, because this is a president who is not committed to running his government in that manner, and it trickles down from the top.
Can I say one positive thing? I completely agree with Joyce, and I think in pointing to independent inspectors
It'll
general.
be nice to hear a
critical.
positive thing.
Well, I do
Does
think
that mean I
one
can have a job, Attorney General Wiley?
I'm more likely to be working for you, Joyce. But the thing I wanted to point out, which is so important, is we've had Republican governors pushing back against some of the statements we've heard from Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell, including, states are poorly run, they should just become bankrupt, let them apply for bankruptcy. By the way, they can't lawfully apply for bankruptcy. The Supreme Court has interpreted the US Constitution to say they cannot. So that's off the table. That should be clear. But the fact that you have Republican governors actually stepping up and saying that that's not how this is done, and we have a National Governors Association that is Democrat and Republican that has said, we all need $500 billion more to help us meet the needs of our people. And for a lot of governors, that includes helping them vote fairly and safely, as Joyce pointed out. So the fact that the National Governors Association tends to hang more together across red and blue, because the interests of states are so much more consistent. And I don't think any of those Republican governors, if there's a Democrat in the White House, want to hear that there's a precedent that a US president can say, do as I say, or you will starve.
Next question from the audience. You both talked about the right to vote, the critical elections coming up. Biden warned that Trump may interfere with election if it's not going his way. We've seen William Barr already change the rules for inside the Justice Department for how investigations of political candidates can be undertaken in an election year. How much should we be afraid of William Barr utilizing the Justice Department and the full force of the federal government to interfere in a way helpful for Donald Trump in the 2020 election?
So the Constitution and the law are pretty clear here. Congress sets the date for these federal elections. The White House and William Barr can't change that as a matter of law. And this country has voted through many similar crises, right? We voted through world wars, for instance. So that's the legal terrain here. I think, unfortunately, we've now lived through 3 years of an administration where when lawyers come along and say the president can't do X, the president sometimes seems to find a way to do X. And because the Republican Party doesn't push back, he gets away with it. So here's the very simple decision point. If the president and his attorney general were to try to take an action that's clearly unwarranted under law and move the elections, would the Republican Party push back? And I am actually going to go out on a limb here and say that that would be a bridge too far. For Republicans in Congress, for Republicans in leadership, if our Constitution and our laws mean anything, it means that Congress gets to set the date and that we as a country will vote in November whether the president wants that election to take place or not. If that doesn't happen, we're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I think Joyce is absolutely right. What I would add was the earlier points. I think the ways in which Donald Trump can try to both manipulate the power of government to undermine the types of protections government should be undertaking is something we should be concerned about and paying attention to. And the fact that it is not training law enforcement's eye on ways in which people may be trying to manipulate the election, and that we haven't had sufficient investment in dealing with the kind of foreign interference and protecting our ballot from all kinds of manipulation, from false information and manipulative information to literally hacking ballot boxes. I mean, that's another great reason for absentee balloting, vote by mail, is a paper ballot. It's a lot harder to interfere with that than a machine that could be hacked. So I think there are lots of ways in which the mechanics matter, and that the way in which citizens pay attention to what is happening in your state and the degree to which resources are going to do that kind of procedural protection matters a lot. Because again, we're not telling people how to vote, we're just making sure they can and that their vote counts. And that should be something that everyone cares about, no matter who you're ultimately going to vote for. That is what the Constitution protects, and that's what we should demand, not just our federal government, but also our state governments protect. And that is something where voters have a lot of power. The problem here, I think, is, again, federal government holds the purse strings so tight that now that states are seeing serious financial challenges, laying off public workers, that what we need to worry about is the resources for them to do all the things that they can do so that it's procedurally protected. But you know what, I just want one little anecdote. When I worked for the Southern District of New York, we were asked to volunteer our time to poll watch, and we did.
I want to end, we only have a couple minutes left. You've alluded to the prisons, individuals who are at serious health risk because they're in prisons. You've alluded to immigrants in New York City. But we've been talking very esoteric terms, rule of law, constitutional rights. I want to leave with, what are the implications for everyday Americans? Whether their health, their rights, how are what we're talking about directly impacting not the lawyers on this phone call, but our neighbors, people across the country, the most vulnerable people in our country? Why are these issues regarding the rule of law, Justice Department independence, why the everyday American sitting around the dining room table this evening, why should they care about these really important issues?
You know, our country, oh, sorry, Maya.
Go ahead, Joyce.
No, Joyce.
Our country is about an idea, right? The idea that all men are created equal. We've been imperfect in how we've achieved it, but that idea has always animated our country when it's at its best. We made a decision, our founding fathers made a decision that we would have a president, not a king, someone with limited power. And the reason for that was so that we would all be subjected to the same set of rules, so that we would no longer have a King George who could set himself up to hold the power of the purse string, to dispense justice at his whim, so that people would live as his subjects and not as free and independent people. Not to be about as subtle as a sledgehammer here, but when you have a president, and a president whose cabinet makes it possible for him to hold himself above the law, then that diminishes the rights that all of us have as citizens. It makes it less likely that we can live our lives in the way that we choose to and maximize our opportunity. So at a very kitchen table sort of level, the behaviors that we've seen during this administration and from this Justice Department have diminished our ownership in our America so that other people could profit or could set rules that they wanted to set. And I think if we feel diminished, happiness in our own lives because we know that there are immigrants who remain in custody in unconscionable conditions, or if we come to have concerns that our government is being run not to afford Americans' best interests, but to expand the president's chances of winning in November, then in many concrete ways, our lives and our liberty and our happiness are diminished, and we should all take that very personally.
That's so important, and I'll follow up on that with the same point a little bit more down on the actual ground level here in New York, which is, as I said, is an epicenter. When I was counsel to Mayor Bill de Blasio, Zach Carter, who's also a former U.S. attorney, and I worked hand in hand with our city council to pass our first sanctuary city law. And one of the things we talked about when we did that was public health. That if we had, like we have had in the history of New York City, an Ebola scare, a Legionnaire's disease, or other communicable diseases, if we scare people underground and they don't get the help they need and the health care that they need, that one of the things that does is means we can't get a handle on and control of where and how outbreaks are happening and ensure that we can support their health and the health of their families and the health of their neighbors. That's very practical. So now if you want to tell us, when we know our communities better in local government than anybody ever will in federal government, that we are not in a position to protect our residents' ability to go to our hospitals or to go to our courts if they're women being abused by a partner, or to get the help they need for their child that's in one of our public schools because they do not have papers, even when it is the best use of our resources to advance our own city's prosperity, health, social cohesion, then what you're actually doing is harming all of our health. Same thing with white supremacy. It's horrible, obviously, for victims who are Black or Latino or transgender. It's also impacting our Jewish community in ways that are off the charts for us, off the charts. But yet you want to tell us that you're going to take away grants that stop people from engaging in white supremacy, that you are much more interested in changing even the names of our terrorist programs out of the Department of Justice to say Muslim, when it is white supremacists who are actually killing our people in much greater number. It is distracting us from the things that endanger us for an ideological position and in order to advance a division and a fear that keeps us from solving the problems that we share. And we cannot afford that. Not yesterday, not today, and not tomorrow.
Very last question. What can everybody on this call do to remain vigilant and really fight the assaults not only on our Constitution and the rule of law, but the harm that's really being done to the health, the safety, critical legal protections of our fellow citizens and the American people?
So the answer is vote. Vote in November. Vote in your municipal elections if you have those earlier in the year. Make sure that you vote up and down ballot and take the leadership seriously at all levels. And if you're in a state like mine, where the state makes it difficult for some people to vote, help your friends and your neighbors and your family register. Make sure that they've got the ID that they need. Give them a ride to the polls or help them get an absentee ballot if they need one. But that's the real answer here, vote.
Mm-hmm. Definitely vote and definitely help. I mean, the one thing I will say that I think has already happened and that people on this call, on this watching us at home are probably already doing is stay informed. Information is one of our greatest tools that helps us identify where we have to get engaged and what we have to say. And as Joyce pointed out, one of the reasons that Donald Trump goes after inspector generals is because they bring that information to us. So we have to keep demanding the information. We have to keep supporting our electeds in their demand for the information. And then we have to use it when we get it. That includes voting and it includes all the policies we have to weigh in on between elections.
Thank you very much. I'll leave it with two plugs since we're talking about many of these issues will be before the DC Circuit the second most powerful court in the country. Nan began this talk by highlighting Justin Walker, 38 years old, being nominated to the DC Circuit. His hearing will be next Wednesday in the Senate Judiciary Committee. He, among other things, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a health crisis, is strongly on record for wanting to have the courts declare the entire Affordable Care Act unconstitutional. So talking about real world implications of some of these legal issues. If that's done, millions and millions of people, including with pre-existing conditions, in the midst of a pandemic would lose access to quality health care. So that's one. Alliance for Justice and scores of healthcare groups and civil rights organizations and progressives across the country are fighting his nomination. And again, just talking about real world impacts of many of the issues we're talking about. Second, I want to make a plug for 2 weeks from now, our next Holding the Courts discussion, where as COVID-19 cases and deaths continue to rise, as been alluded to by both Joyce and Maya, we've seen stark systematic inequalities, particularly with people in confinement, are significantly at risk. We're gonna hear from attorneys and advocates who are defending the rights and health of detainees, including Catherine Rosenfeld, who's a partner at Emery Selly and co-counsel leading litigation seeking the release of 540 people who are detained in Brooklyn's federal jail. Really hope that everybody who could attend remotely this talk can join that talk as well, as we look at these critical rule of law issues that have arisen both before and have only been exacerbated during the pandemic. But let me just give a huge thank you to Joyce, to Maya. This was a fantastic discussion, and a lot of it was depressing, but a lot of it was also hopeful, linked to a future of Joyce and Maya in whatever position they choose, either AG or Deputy AG. I'll let them choose among themselves who's on the 5th floor and who's on the 4th floor. Talking about these critical issues and linked to a hopeful time when those of us who care deeply about the rule of law and constitutional rights and legal protections are in a position to advance those causes from inside, not just outside, as I know both of you and many of the people on the call today do every day. So thank you so much for giving up your time, your Wednesday evening, for joining us. And please be in touch.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be with you.